Unveiling Freud's theories exposes lust, incest, and, for a woman, penis envy. And Freud was convinced that all of these are psychologically determined by age 5 or 6. Through the element of Greek drama, Freud has convinced the world that every child is filled with a desire for incest and homicide. Every child desires sexual intercourse with the parents of the opposite sex. Every child unconsciously wants the like-sex parent to die, and every child is confronted with castration anxiety. Probably no single individual has had a more profound effect on 20th century thought than Sigmund Freud. His work has influenced psychiatry, anthropology, social work, penology, and education, and provided a seemingly limitless source of material for novelists and dramatists. Freud has created a whole new climate of opinions. For better or worse, he has changed the face of society. Freud's technique of free association, as a method of dream interpretation, has its antecedent in Kabbalistic method of biblical exegesis. Abraham Abulafia developed a method of biblical interpretation that involved the interpreter's meditation upon a free association to the words and letters of the Torah, the ultimate purpose of which was to unseal the soul, to untie the knots which bind it, knots that separate an individual's personal existence from its natural connection with divine life.
Many of Sigmund Freud's nauseating theories emanate from his Kabbalistic upbringing, in which his father and mother raised him. This is documented in David Bacon's book, Sigmund Freud and the Jewish Mystical Traditions.
Both of Freud's parents came from Galicia, a region whose atmosphere was saturated with Hasidism, a late and socially widespread form of Jewish mysticism. Freud says explicitly in a letter to Roback that his father came from Hasidic milieu, and we know from a paper by Aaron that Tismanitz, the birthplace of Jacob Freud, Freud's father, was filled with Hasidic lore and learning. Aaron also reports a conversation between Freud and Chaim Bloch in which they discussed Kabbalah, Hasidism, and Judaism in general. Aaron remarks, what it was that moved Freud to interest himself in Kabbalah and Hasidism is not hard to understand. He must have felt himself to be spiritually at home in these worlds.
This could explain Freud's feeling of superiority towards Gentiles.
At times he would appear as if this hate sprang from his position as a Jew. His attitude towards the Gentile religion is revealed in a letter to Martha when she was his fiancée. He discussed his neurasthenia and what he should do about it. He decided that he would take life more easily and says, "For the rest of my time in the hospital, I will live like the Goys, modestly, learning the ordinary things without striving after discoveries or reaching to the depths." Apparently he felt superior. But if so, there was no compelling reason to use the term Goys, which is a somewhat contemptuous term for Gentiles.
At the Second International Psychoanalytical Congress at Nuremberg in 1910, Freud had proposed that Young be made permanent president. A protest meeting was held in a hotel room. Freud appeared on the scene, and he said,
"Most of you are Jews, and therefore you are incompetent to win friends for the new teaching. Jews must be content with the modest role of preparing the ground. It is absolutely essential that I should form ties in the world of general science. The Swiss will save us, will save me, and all of you as well."
There is no doubt that Carl Jung was chosen to deflect attention from the fact that psychotherapy was influenced by Freud's Jewish surroundings. As a mystic, Jung recognized the Jewish cultural and Kabbalistic roots of Freud's teachings.
For a real understanding of the Jewish component in Freud's outlook, a thorough knowledge would be needed of the specifically Jewish assumptions in regard to history, culture, and religion. Since Freud calls for an extremely serious assessment on all these levels, one would have to take a deep plunge into the history of the Jewish mind. This would carry us beyond Jewish orthodoxy into the subterranean workings of Hasidism, and then into the intricacies of the Kabbalah, which still remains unexplored psychologically.
Joseph Bloch, a prominent figure in the events of the day, approached Freud with the idea of writing an introduction to a German translation of a work by Chaim Vital, the most prominent student and expositor of the Luranic Kabbalah. Sanford Drab, a highly esteemed author in Jewish circles, quotes the preface to the 1975 paperback edition of Sigmund Freud and the Jewish Mystical Tradition, and commented on the occasion.
According to Bloch, Freud read the manuscript and was beside himself with excitement. Freud exclaimed, "This is gold," and queried why Vital's work had never before been brought to his attention. In a meeting in Freud's home, Bloch reports that Freud agreed to write the foreword and even volunteered to assist Bloch in getting the manuscript published. The relationship came to an end, however, when Freud showed Bloch a manuscript of Freud's own Moses and Monotheism. Bloch was aghast, stating, "Anti-Semites accuse us of killing the founder of Christianity. Now a Jew adds that we also killed the founder of Judaism." Bloch reports that Freud left the room in anger, leaving Bloch in the library. In that library, according to Bloch, was a large collection of Judaica, including a number of books on the Kabbalah in German and French translation of the Zohar.
The book Kabbalistic Metaphors brings to light many parallels between Freudian psychoanalysis and the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria. Besides his fascination with the Kabbalah, Freud was a loyal member of the Vienna B'nai B'rith Lodge. Only Jews are allowed to be members of this chauvinistic lodge. It is also noteworthy to mention that almost all of his colleagues, with Jung as the outstanding exception, were Jews.
Participation in the B'nai B'rith Lodge in Vienna was one of the very few recreations that Freud permitted himself. Among his recreations was his weekly game of tarot, a popular card game based on Kabbalah.
Jung's neo-paganism and his desire to replace Christianity with his own concept of psychoanalysis can be seen in a letter he wrote to Freud.
"I imagine a far finer and more comprehensive task for psychoanalysis than alliance with an ethical fraternity. I think we must give it time to infiltrate into people from many centers, to revivify among intellectuals a feeling for symbol and myth, ever so gently to transform Christ back into the soothsaying God of the vine, which he was, and in this way absorb those ecstatic, instinctical forces of Christianity for the one purpose of making the cult and the sacred myth what they once were, a drunken feast of joy where man regained the ethos and holiness of an animal."
Freud must have seen in Jung a student who would perpetuate his own disdain and perversion of Christianity. The amazing thing about the psychoanalytic theory is that it is not based on science. It is spawned from a perverted, demented mind. The widely acclaimed Encyclopedia Judica describes Freud's pseudo-scientific theory with a tincture of euphemism.
While Freud's theories may easily be faulted for the lack of control in data collection, the failure to check on the validity of their factual basis, and the impossibility of deriving testable hypotheses from them, they nevertheless gave rise to a flourishing and viable school of psychology. Beyond the field of psychology, psychoanalytic theory has widely influenced our culture in many ways, particularly in art and literature.
Many of Freud's theories are patently ridiculous. In an effort to save psychotherapy, some psychotherapists have jettisoned some of his theories while preserving its Kabbalistic roots. Even Freud himself admits that he is not a man of science, but describes himself as a conquistador, adventurer, and he uses other colorful expressions.
"I am actually not at all a man of science, not an observer, not an experimenter, not a thinker. I am by temperament nothing but a conquistador, an adventurer. if you want it translated, with all the curiosity, daring, and tenacity characteristic of a man of this sort.
We need not go to the synagogue of Satan seeking mental health, but trust in the gospel of Christ, which is the power of God to all who believe.
In whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them.
Here, in his own words, is Freud's explanation for why people become psychiatrists.
Do you know why psychiatrists go into their specialty? It is because they do not feel that they are normal, and they go into this work because it is a means of sublimation for this feeling, a means of assuring themselves that they are really normal. Society puts them in charge of the mentally abnormal, and so they feel reassured.
I believe that Sigmund Freud, the creator of psychotherapy, and his Jewish associates were insane. In the heyday of Freud's popularity, insanity ranked higher among the Jews than any other nation. This blistering statement is documented in the Jewish Encyclopedia 1905 edition.
Among the Jews, the proportion of insane has been observed to be very large. From statistics collected by Buskin, he concludes that they are 4 to 6 times more liable to mental disease than are non-Jews. In the various provinces of Germany and also in Denmark, the percentage of Jewish insane is very large, as is seen from the figures in the appended table. In this table, the proportion of Jewish insane is in nearly all places very large, in some cases more than double that of the non-Jewish population. Among the 723 non-Jewish male insane, 173 were found to be affected with alcoholic insanity. Among the 496 female patients, 22. As not one Jew or Jewish was affected with alcoholism, are deducted, the relative percentage of Jewish insanity is perceptibly increased.
Perhaps Freud was attempting to invent an antidote for the epidemic of insanity among his race. Some might consider it taboo to be quoting from the 1905 Jewish Encyclopedia on Jewish insanity. So I consulted the voluminous Encyclopedia Judica, published in 1973, to see what current Jewish scholarship has to say regarding Jewish insanity. It did not surprise me that Jewish insanity was no longer open for investigation. In other words, it was not included. I will quote from 2 prominent Jerusalem psychiatrists who have worked for 20 years in the Community Mental Health Center at Herzog Hospital in Jerusalem. In their 2001 book, Sanity and Sanctity, Mental Health Work Among the Ultra-Orthodox in Jerusalem, the overall conclusion to be drawn from reading this book is that the Jewish mantle of insanity has continued unabated since the concoction of the Talmud and the Kabbalah. Those 2 eminent Jewish psychiatrists stated that 40% of their patients experience religious experiences before their admissions.
The data we have presented do not permit us to draw conclusions about whether and how Jerusalem's religious ambience induces psychiatric disturbance. Nevertheless, over a quarter of the sample were attracted to Jerusalem for overtly mystical religious motives, and 40% had had mystical religious experiences before their admission.
After studying the insane teachings of the Talmud and the Kabbalah, I believe that those who follow these venomous volumes are at high risk of being insane. Christ's words describe what happens to people who seek aid through the nebulous teachings of psychotherapy.
They be blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch.
Sigmund Freud laid the foundation for psychotherapy and paved it with Kabbalah. Not only is he considered the father of psychotherapy, but his ideas also permeate latter-day theories and therapies. I leave you with a quote from an article entitled The Jewish Century in the Weekend Post. This quote serves to illustrate the indelible mark Sigmund Freud has left upon millions of people.
Psychiatrists and therapists throughout the world who use Freudian ideas in their treatments are now numbered in the millions. At a more popular level, Freud has influenced the world by his impact on artists of all kinds, writers especially, but also painters and composers. Freud may have been a bad scientist, but he was certainly a stylist and neologist of genius. Many of his terms have passed into all languages: the Oedipus complex, inferiority complex, infantile sexuality, guilt complex, transference, sublimation, the ego, the id, and the superego, plus such phrases foisted on him as the death wish and the Freudian slip. He became to a greater extent than any other writer thinker of modern times the provider of smart new mental furniture for the 20th century intellect. The effect on human behavior in the 20th century, therefore, has been inestimable.
Christ is able to cure all maladies, but only if the world would trust him.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, and of love, and of a sound mind. Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. Shall a man make gods unto himself, and they are no gods? Because all substance is thus ultimately an overflowing of God's substance, Kabbalah is a pantheistic doctrine. To the trained pantheist, the abstraction is the ever-to-be unknown deity. Notwithstanding the strongly pantheistic coloring of its metaphysics, the Kabbalah never attempted to belittle the importance of historic Judaism. The author of the Zohar proper, as we shall have occasion to see, inclines towards pantheism.
This might come as a shock to many people. Monotheistic Judaism, when it evolves into mysticism, becomes pantheistic. The pantheism of the Kabbalah is cleverly hidden. Like searching for a chameleon, you have to look carefully to see it. A highly esteemed and widely quoted scholar, considered an authority on the Kabbalah, gives the following example.
Apparent theistic tendencies can serve to conceal actually pantheistic views. Examples of this are Azrael's pronouncement that nothing is outside, Ein Sof, Mir Ibn Gabai declaration that everything is in him and he is in everything, or the recurring insistence in the Zohar that God is everything and that everything is unified in him, as is known to the mystics. Strictly speaking, however, the problem of pantheism does occur in connection with a number of specific questions that greatly preoccupied Kabbalistic speculation, and to which pantheistic doctrines were at least able to offer unambiguous answers.
The Kabbalist response to creation is never theistic. It depends on an emanationist approach. The theology of macro and microcosm made it complex. Sundry intermediaries and the 10 Sephirot multiply the pantheistic tendencies.
Abandoning an unacceptable theistic doctrine is a step towards a pantheistic position. If pantheism requires a creation doctrine, some type of emanationism seems most plausible. The heterogeneous elements of this Talmudic mysticism are as yet unfused. The Platonic Alexandrian, Oriental Theosophic, and Judeo-allegorical ingredients being still easily recognizable and not yet elaborated into the system of the Kabbalah. Jewish monotheism was still transcendentalism, but as mysticism attempted to solve the problems of creation and world government by introducing sundry intermediary personages, creative potentialities such as Metatron, Shekinah, and so on, the more necessary it became to exalt God in order to prevent his reduction to a mere shadow, this exaltation being rendered possible by the introduction of the pantheistic doctrine of emanation, which taught that in reality nothing existed outside of God. The visions which these mystics beheld in their ecstasies were considered as real, giving rise within the pale of Judaism to an anthropomorphic mysticism which took its place beside that of the pantheists.
Daniel Matt is a professor at the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He received his PhD from Brandeis University and has taught at Stanford University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In his book, God and the Big Bang, he quoted the 16th century Kabbalist Moses Cordevero's pantheistic views. Moses Cordovero was a well-known mystic of the 16th century, and his influence continues today.
By calling God Ein Sof, Jewish mystics imply that everything is divine. The Kabbalist Moses Cordovero, writing in the 16th century, put it this way: the essence of divinity is found in every single thing. Nothing but it exists. Since it causes everything to be, no thing can live by anything else. It enlivens them. Ein Sof exists in each existent. Do not say, this is a stone and not God. God forbid. Rather, all existence is God, and the stone is a thing pervaded by divinity.
New Age guru and sage Deepak Chopra mentioned the connection between the Kabbalah and Hinduism in the New York Magazine. He admits that it's so craftily put together that most Jews would not recognize it. Here he is pictured with his close friend Rabbi Shmuley Botiak, the New Age Kabbalist.
This year, Deepak Chopra will conduct workshops in Israel. Chopra told me, most Jews don't know it, he said, but the parallels between the Kabbalah and Hinduism are amazing. He ran through a list of Hebrew words and religious concepts that sounded very much like their Sanskrit counterparts.
A Max Copper professor of Jewish thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem confirms the previous appellations of Chopra.
One cannot underrate the possibility that Hindu traditions infiltrated into Kabbalah, perhaps via the intermediacy of Sufi material, a fact that may be a clue to the penetration of an alien mystical technique into a Jewish milieu.
Now, there is a text within Judaism, the Chumash, known as the Bible, where we are told that Abraham sends his sons, through his wife Hagar, to the lands of the east, La'artzei Kedem. Now, we understand the lands of the east to refer to India, Hodu. The text goes on and says that he gave his sons gifts, presents, matanot. And these gifts and presents are understood to be spiritual insights of high order. And it's presumably they did go, the sons, to the lands of the east. And we find within the Indian tradition, for example, there is a historical tradition whereby a fair-skinned people came from the other side and introduced some of the earlier wisdoms into what became part of the Eastern religions. In fact, if you look into the Indian tradition, they actually named a river after the Abraham who sent his sons. That river's name is Indus. the Indus River, and in Indian Indus means the other side. So it's a very interesting little point of conjecture, how it got there by name. Furthermore, we're told that they adopted Abraham's name as a name for one of the deities, Brahman. The word Brahman is a reassociation of letters of Abraham. Furthermore, one of the sons of Abraham is referred to in the Chumash, in the Bible, as Ashurim. Ashurim introduced the ashrams. The Veda poetry, for example, is related to the Hebrew word yadeya, knowledge, insight. Then we have another term, prana, which abounds in one of these traditions, which relates to the Hebrew word pe'er, an elevated point of beauty. We also have the Indian word ram, which means exactly the same what the word ram means in Hebrew, elevated, high. You can go even further and talk about the Indian word for spiritual impurity, which is tamas, which in Hebrew is tameh. So it's absolutely fascinating to see how even at the level of terminology we have a very clear association between what we call our Jewish mystical tradition, stemming from Kabbalah, which I'll explain shortly, and some of these other traditions. And perhaps even more fascinating is at the conceptual level, where the concepts within, for example, Buddhism, one finds very clearly enunciated within Judaism, within the Kabbalistic tradition. So we certainly do find a number of very strong parallels between the Jewish mystical tradition Kabbalah and a lot of the Eastern traditions.
When we examine Hinduism with its many deities, we Westerners would be tempted to ask, how could they keep track with all those deities? Any good authority on Hinduism and the occult will explain that all these different deities reveal different attributes to the unmanifest deity, which they call Brahmanutra. Brahmanutra is the spirit that receives reverence when the Hindus worship these myriads of deities. He is called the unmanifest, yet still he is manifest through all these different gods. This is called inclusive or multi-level pantheism.
Such is the simple and natural explanation of the 33 crores gods in India. These gods were begotten and endowed with being as a result of the blind endeavor to personify that which cannot be personified, thus giving rise to idols. In the course of time, the cornerstone of the philosophic and religious world conception of their wise men found itself in the hands of the ambitious, coldly calculating Brahmanism, who broke the stone into chips and ground it into the dust for the convenient assimilation by the masses. But for the thinker, as well as for every unprejudiced Orientalist, these mishappen chips, as well as their finely crushed gravel, are none the less, from the very same stone, attributes of the manifested energy of Para-Brahman, the one that forever is, without beginning or end. The Davi Upanishad continues, "She is all the gods, those worshipped in our religion and those worshipped in other religions. She manifests as the divine beings and as the demonic beings. Therefore worship me in whatever form appeals to you, and I promise, in that very form I will come to you. This is the reason you can travel from the Mother's Temple in Kamakaya at the northern edge of India to her shrine at Kanyakumari at the southernmost tip of the subcontinent without one Hindu trying to convert you. In India, they say, there is only one goddess, therefore all other gods are real. Hindu texts claim there are 33 million gods and that there is only one divine being. All deities are different faces of that one inconceivable being."
Hindu philosophers and theologians began to systemize ideas that had not been fully worked out in the Upanishads. In the late 8th and early 9th century CE, a talented philosopher named Shankara would become the most celebrated exponent of the position which eventually became known as Advaita Vedanta. Advaita literally means not two. Advaita Vedanta therefore claims that the ultimate Brahman and the individual self or Atman are one and the same. Shankara said that the gods are lower forms of the one Brahman. He said people do not harm themselves by worshipping a personal god. Shankara himself was a devotee of the god Shiva. But Shankara believed that eventually each person must go beyond dependence on individual deities. He said that each of us will realize that all distinct gods are imperfect reflections of what he called the Brahman without qualities.
A universally accepted authority on Freemasonry documents this pantheistic monotheism.
The spirit of the Vedas, as understood by their earliest as well as most recent expositors, is decidedly a pantheistic monotheism, one God, and he all in all, the many divinities, numerous as the prayers addressed to them, being resolvable into the titles and attributes of a few, and ultimately into the one.
Knowledgeable witches like Anne Mora would not deny that the sources that I quoted are impeccable. She points out the inclusive pantheistic monotheism in the androgynous deities of Shiva and Shakti.
Of the two sides of deity, it was the female that received many different names to express her various attributes, but the male retained his name and had the attributes listed afterwards. I generally refer to the primary deities of the Indus as Shiva and Shakti, or Shiva and Uma Parvati, but over the millennia the aspects and descriptives of both deities, particularly those of the goddess, have come to be proper names. This does not reflect a multitude of goddesses or gods, but one goddess and one god, conjoined and approachable in different names, depicting ways for different purposes, under different names depicting various aspects. The duality of the god and the goddess is monotheistic approach that recognizes the inherent oneness in nature resulting from a natural twosome. A whole has two halves, yet remains a whole, and the whole may be divided into numerous segments, yet remains a whole. Shiva and Shakti are independent. As Ardhanari, they are one.
The secret doctrine of the priests of Chaldea is identical to what we just read.
The ancient thinkers, priests, who framed the vague guesses of the groping, dreaming mind into schemes and systems of profound meaning, expressed this sense of the twofold nature of things by worshipping a double divine being or principle, masculine and feminine. Thus, every god was supplied with a wife through the entire series of divine emanations and manifestations. And as all the gods were in reality only different names and forms of the supreme and unfathomable one, so all the goddesses represent only Belit, the great feminine principle of nature, productiveness, maternity, tenderness, also contained, like everything else, in that one, and emanating from it in endless succession. Hence it come that the goddesses of the Chaldeo-Babylonian religion, though different in name and apparently in attributions, become wonderfully alike when looked at closer. They are all more or less repetitions of Belit, the wife of Bel. Her name, which is only the feminine form of the god's meaning, the lady, as Bel means the Lord, sufficiently shows that the two are really one.
100 years ago, Wallace Budge was keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum. In his book, Amulets and Talismans, he stated that the Egyptians and the Pythagoreans revered the number one as sacred to deity.
The number one represented God. The Egyptian declared in his hymns to Ra that he was the one. The Pythagoreans made one equal the deity indivisible and embracing all things.
We previously stated that the Muslim god Allah was and still is the chief deity in the shrine in Mecca. The Quran of today has been altered to hide the apparent pagan expressions attributed to Allah. However, there is enough material in the widely read translation of Yusuf Ali to show that Islam did not escape its polytheistic and pantheistic expressions of deity by its predecessors.
To God belong the east and the west. Whithersoever ye turn, there is the face of God. For God is all-pervading, all-knowing. It was we who created man, and we know what dark suggestions his soul makes to him, for we are nearer to him than his jugular vein. Is it ye who create it, or are we the creators?
We learn from the preceding quote that Allah is all-pervading, which means that he is in everything. This is inverted pantheism at its best. Then we see that sometimes he is mentioned in a polytheistic manner. There is a reason for this. Muhammad was confused. Having been brought up in a pagan environment, he was trying to separate Allah from his polytheistic surroundings, and so he refashioned him to be the monotheistic God of the Bible. Allah was and still is the head of the Arabian pantheon. Similarly, the god El is the head of the Phoenician pantheon.
El is the first of the major gods and the head of the pantheon. In the epithets that are applied to him, he is seen as the father of the gods and human beings, and as the creator of heaven and earth. The totality of the gods constitutes his family, and he presides over the assembly of the gods.
Ultimate pantheism is a creation of Satan to make us believe that all religions lead to the same God. CNN founder Ted Turner, in the magazine Hinduism Today, promulgates this religious pluralism.
There are so many different languages, so many different forms of music, and so much different dance, so many different cultures, but basically we are all the same. So I thought, maybe instead of all these different gods, maybe there's one God who manifests himself and revealed himself in different ways, different people. What about that, huh? All right.
This was stated at the United Nations Unprecedented Babylonian Gathering held from August 28 to September 1, 2000. The agenda was to promote a universal pantheistic agreement, one that considered all religions as being true. Christ's words, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me," are viewed as arrogance or even worse, religious intolerance.
Ask about the issue of proselytization, which came up repeatedly, and he, Bawa Jain, said, I think the message is to be that each religion needs to reach out to its adherents and ask them to become more faithful to their own tradition. It is not a matter of seeking to convert people from other religions. I think that is sometimes the cause of a lot of conflict and a lot of aggravation. I really think the Christian leaders will have to sit down with the other leaders and come up with how not to engage in active proselytization, and rather create an awareness of more respect and understanding for each religion.
Here is a picture of Madame Blavatsky with her ascended masters. The occultists believe that the term ascended masters refers to those souls who, after many incarnations and life experiences, have mastered the lessons of the physical realm. They then choose whether to serve on planet Earth or to channel from other realms and dimensions. If Blavatsky was alive today, she would have echoed something similar to what was stated at the United Nations conference.
Better to believe at least in one of the qualities of divinity, personifying and worshipping it under that particular guise, which represents to each one, according to the power of his understanding, the most convenient semblance and symbol of the All, than to deny the All.
The secret strength of the Kabbalah lies within the chameleon-like pantheism that appears monotheistic to the brainwashed and pantheistic to those who are able to discern the truth. Here are a few more quotes from gurus of Kabbalistic scholarship to demonstrate that this is not mere speculation concerning this important point.
The path of immanence only rarely occurred in Theosophical Kabbalah. Pantheistic views are indeed presented in the works of Rabbi Moses de Leon, Rabbi Joseph of Hamadan, Rabbi Joseph ben Shalom, Ashkenazi, and later on Rabbi Moses Cordovero. But even these Kabbalists would unequivocally acknowledge the existence of a transcendent layer of divine, For these, and for similar authors, the pantheistic or panentheistic ideas were the ultimate consequences of their emanational systems. Extreme substantialist interpretation of emanation could, and actually did, lead to a variety of pantheistic views. Apparent theistic tendencies can serve to conceal actually pantheistic views. Examples of this are Azrael's pronouncement that nothing is outside, Ein Sof, Meir ibn Gabbai declaration that everything is in him and he is in everything, or the recurring insistence in the Zohar that God is everything and that everything is unified in him, as is known to the mystics. Such formulations in the Zohar became extremely popular among later Kabbalists and in the writing of Hasidism, where they were used to bridge theistic and pantheistic opinions abounding in these texts.